All right, I feel like the numbers have started to kind of even out and we have quite a few people in here. So let's just go ahead and get started now, not waste any more of your time. All right, so welcome everybody. In today's presentation, we're going to be covering the basics of importing FDA products. Now, this process of importing FDA can be very specific to each FDA commodity. So today we are going to focus on the basics so that we can hopefully cover a more in-depth look at the process in the future. My name is Meredith Lambert. I will be your host and presenter during today's presentation. I am the marketing manager here at TRG, which basically translates to being responsible for researching and creating the educational content for all of you. So let me know how I do. Joining me today is Rachel Bauman, who is TRG's bond claims manager. Rachel helps importers navigate the confusion of receiving a claim on their customs bond and aids in getting penalties mitigated when possible. She will be joining us at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. This webinar is being presented by Trade Risk Guaranty, or as many of you know us as, TRG. We are located in the heart of downtown Bozeman, Montana, and have been providing U.S. customs bonds and cargo insurance solutions directly to importers since 1991. This direct-to-importer business model is unique to the international trade community since it cuts out the need for an additional middleman and allows TRG to become another member of your international trade team. We will be recording this webinar and it will be available on YouTube for future reference. If you want to be notified the moment it releases, I highly recommend you subscribe to our YouTube channel. We also post additional educational videos on YouTube about once a month. So if you're not already, go ahead and subscribe to our channel. You can find us by searching Trade Risk Guarantee -TRG in YouTube. Please submit your questions in the question box in the webinar interface throughout the presentation. We will be answering as many of them as we can at the end. However, if you have any questions during the presentation and you submit them and we are not able to get to them, basically, because I do foresee this being a little bit longer of a webinar, of a presentation, then we will be reaching out after the webinar to try to answer as many as we can. We also are going to be going through some of the pre-submitted questions, questions that were submitted in the registration for this presentation. We're going to be answering a few of those at the end of the presentation. So as always, if you're attending a future webinar of ours, we do encourage you to submit your questions beforehand so that we can try to get to more of them. Now, as a quick disclaimer, the information in this presentation is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice. All right, so let's jump right in. So today we're going to be going over three topics, three primary topics at least. What products are subject to FDA regulations, the process of importing FDA commodities, and finally, why your surety is concerned about FDA. Let's get started with what products are subject to FDA regulations. Since we have a large variety of skill levels joining us in this webinar, I thought it would be a good place to start with a little bit of background. First off, what is FDA? Well, FDA stands for Food and Drug Administration, and they are a federal agency within the United States Department of Health and Human Services. Other countries do have their own FDA agencies that are responsible for monitoring imports into those countries. So make sure you clarify between different regulations country to country before you are to export as well. The US FDA is responsible for protecting the public health by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and oh my gosh, I always say that, stumble on that one, veterinary drugs, biological products, and medical devices. and by ensuring the safety of our nation's food supply, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation. We will not be going into this, or sorry, we will be going into this in further slides, specifically those categories. But it is important to remember that the FDA is not only food and drug, but also includes many other products that impact the health and safety of the public. Now, in the most basic terms, the FDA regulates anything that is placed in or on the body, or on a living body. But a better breakdown of types of products are encompassed in the following. And these are the categories that the FDA uses themselves. So you can actually find most of their information on their website is typically broke down into these categories. So human foods. Of course, this refers to foods for human consumption, but it also includes dietary supplements, color additives, baby formula, bottled water, etc. Human drugs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, and both prescription and over-the-counter medication. So this is, brand names and off brands, generic brands, pretty much anything that falls under those. Vaccines, blood, and biologics. Biologic products such as human blood, blood donor screening test, human tissue, embryos, human plasma, and medical devices for use in blood banking operations. Medical devices. Medical devices such as first aid kits, pacemakers, and surgical instruments. This one is a pretty broad category that even covers things like tongue depressors. So really, that will be something that is touching the skin, interacting with a living body. So yes, that is regulated by the FDA. Radiation emitting electronic products. Radiation emitting products include things such as X-ray machines, microwave ovens, CD-ROMs, and laser pointers. Cosmetics. Cosmetic products such as shampoo, makeup, and face creams. Again, anything, it's going to be interacting with the living body in some way. Animal and veterinary. This is animal food and feed, as well as veterinary medicines. Tobacco products. FDA regulated tobacco products such as cigarettes, smokeless tobacco, e-cigarettes, and other electronic nicotine delivery systems, cigars, and all other tobacco products. So, as I mentioned, this chart includes the 8 primary categories of products that the FDA regulates. As you can see, this is a very wide range of products beyond just food and drugs, but the general rule stands. If the product will be ingested by a living body, placed inside of a living body, applied to the skin, has an emission that interacts with a living body, or even is used to contain or carry something that will do one of these things, it is regulated by the FDA. To give you a better idea of the FDA's activities over the course of 2019, this is a pie chart the agency published showing the percentage of imported lines by commodity type. So despite the fact that it is called Food and Drug Administration, you can see that 48% of the imports the FDA oversaw last year were devices. These devices encompass items such as blood pumps, pacemakers, laboratory tests, etc. So it's a pretty big category there, but it's definitely not something a lot of people think of when they first think FDA. Now, we did receive a few questions about the overlap between the regulations of the FDA and those of other partner government agencies. As a reminder, a single commodity can be regulated by 2 or more different partner government agencies. For example, cell phones are regulated by the FDA and by the FCC, which is, of course, the Federal Communications Commission. The FCC sets the limits on the emissions of radio frequency energy by cell phones, while the FDA makes recommendations on what those limits should be based on should be based on how they affect the health and safety of the public. So those two PGAs work together to set those regulations, and then they both oversee them. So if you're bringing in cell phones, you would be subject to regulations by both of those PGAs. Since it is nearly impossible to list off every commodity that is overseen by more than one PGA, this chart identifies a few aspects of products that are not overseen solely by the FDA. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are the some of the product aspects specifically mentioned on the FDA's website. So advertising. Sometimes you might think of advertising on a food package as only overseen by the FDA. That is not necessarily, or that is not the case. The Federal Trade Commission is the federal agency that regulates many types of advertising. The FTC protects consumers by stopping unfair, deceptive, or fraudulent practices in the marketplace. So if there is something wrong with how the product is advertised, that's going to go through the FTC. Alcohol. The Department of Treasury's Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, also known as the TTB, regulates aspects of alcohol production, importation, wholesale distribution, labeling, and advertising. Consumer products. The Consumer Product Safety Commission, the CPSC, works to ensure the safety of consumer products such as toys, cribs, power tools, cigarettes, household chemicals, and other products that pose a fire, electrical, chemical, or mechanical hazard. Drugs of abuse. This is overseen by the Department of Justice Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. They work to enforce the controlled substances laws and regulations in the U.S., including as they pertain to the manufacture, distribution, and dispensing of legally produced controlled substances. So you can see how in the previous slide we mentioned, tobacco is overseen by the FDA. Well, and also, prescription drugs. Well, if one of those things fell into a drugs of abuse, that would be overseen by both of those PGAs. Meat and poultry. So the FDA, obviously it is a food, so that would involve the FDA. However, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Food Safety and Inspection Service regulates aspects of the safety and labeling of traditional non-game meats, poultry, and certain egg products. So it would be those two PGAs overseeing that aspect together. Pesticides. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, regulates many aspects of pesticides. The EPA sets limits on how much of a pesticide may be used on food during growing and processing, and how much can remain on the food that the end consumer is going to buy. Vaccines for animal diseases. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, the APHIS, Center for Veterinary Biologics. They regulate aspects of veterinary vaccines and other type of veterinary biologics. Water. The Environmental Protection Agency, again, the EPA, regulates aspects of drinking water. The EPA develops national standards for drinking water from municipal water supplies to limit levels of impurities. So again, all of these are examples of, more than one PGA being involved in different aspects of commodities. All right, so now that we have a better idea of what products are regulated by the FDA, let's go through the process of importing FDA commodities. As a quick disclaimer for this section, the process of filing an FDA entry and the specific paperwork required depends on that specific commodity. So whatever commodity you are bringing in is going to have very specific requirements. Therefore, the best individual to talk to about what is required for your unique situation would be the customs broker you are working with to file your FDA entries. Remember, having an open dialogue with your broker is necessary to ensure you are both as informed as possible on the process. No one knows your product better than you, So this open dialogue will help get your questions answered, but it will also help your broker determine the correct course of action to take for your entry. So let's get into it. Okay, so the first step is determining if your imported commodity is subject to FDA regulations and what the next steps are. The HTS code for the commodity you are importing may be flagged with an indicator known as an FD flag, which acts as a guide on what information is required. However, and this can be confusing, not all HTS codes have FD flags. The information required upon importation is based on the intended use of the product. So keep in mind what the FDA regulates and ask yourself if your imported commodity falls into one of those categories. If so, you will have to file the FDA paperwork regardless of if the flag exists on the HTS code or not. Now let's go through these flags. FD1. These products may or may not be regulated by the FDA. If it is regulated by the FDA, you must submit the entry information. If it is not regulated by the FDA, you must disclaim why it would not be regulated. So an example of this would be certain chemicals used in manufacturing drug products versus those used for industrial use, or safety goggles used for medical use versus non-medical use. Now, some of that has changed, which we'll get into a bit when it comes to PPE. However, going back to the chemical example there, the chemicals used for manufacturing drug products obviously are going to be regulated by the FDA. It is being used for a drug product. However, those for industrial use, if they're not being used in a way that's going to be ingested by, a living being, potentially are not going to be regulated by the FDA. However, you do run the risk of, if you don't disclaim why, what the use is on your product and explain why it, wouldn't need to be regulated by the FDA may flag your import because they're going to maybe assume that you're using it in a way that needs to be regulated. So this is where that disclaim part becomes really important. So FD2, these items are regulated by the FDA, but are not food. So you must submit entry information. And this includes medical devices, drugs, tobacco, and cosmetics. If you're importing one of those things, you are absolutely regulated by the FDA, but you're not necessarily food. FD3, these are items that may or may not be a food product. If they are a food product, then you must submit prior notice and the entry information. If they are not a food product, then you must disclaim how they are not. So a great example of this would be salt used for flavoring food versus salt used for treating road surfaces. So if you're just bringing in salt and the only information you've provided is that it's salt, the FDA is most likely going to flag that and assume that it is the salt used for flavoring food. So again, disclaim if it is not. FD4, these are food products, and you must submit prior notice and entry information. The examples here are pretty obvious, but notice that this also includes feed additives, beverages, supplements, etc. Things that we may not think of as food, but their intended purpose is to be ingested. So we did receive a question on where an importer can look up the FD flags for their HTS codes themselves. I have to admit I had a really hard time on this question. I thought it would be as simple as looking up the HTS code on the online HTS, seeing if there was a column for FD flags, and there you go. But there is no such column. Then I tried to see if there was a way to look up the HTS code without having an entry number already tied to the FDA database, and I honestly could not find a way. Ultimately, all I could definitively find was that the FD flag should be indicated when the entry filer is filing out the entry documentation. This leads me to believe that the indicator shows up within the entry software the entry filer is using, so whether that is ACE or a third-party software. Since the majority of importers hire a customs broker to file their entries, the importer would not really have easy access to an entry filing software that would display these indicators. Honestly, I'm going to keep looking into this one because I feel like, there has to be a way that you can find these FD flags, and I just have not been able to find it. Since I am not a customs broker myself, I will also be consulting with a few that we have at our sister company Strix to see if they have a resource that is accessible to the public. So I'm hoping I'll find an answer on this one and it can be included in a follow-up email. Now, moving on to what information is required. So you have already determined that your commodity is subject to FDA, and now it is time to file the FDA paperwork. You will notice in the previous slide that prior notice was required on some types of entry. We are not going to go into prior notice today since it definitely gets a little too in-depth for a basics presentation. But the most important thing to understand is that the purpose of filing prior notice is to give the FDA enough time before the goods arrive to determine if an inspection will be necessary. So if prior notice is required for your entry type, for the commodity that you're bringing in, it is required. It's a requirement. There's not really, similar to the ISF filing, there's not really a substitution for prior notice. It is a required part of the process. All right, so now there are two ways of filing FDA paperwork, electronically and manually. The overall information requirements are the same for both. It is really only how you file them and how the initial review is handled. Those two things are different, and we're going to be going into that. So the information required is the following: commodity type and subtype, product code, product description, country code identifying where the product was produced, sourced, grown, or harvested, names and addresses of the manufacturer, shipper, importer, delivered to party. You can use the FEI portal to look up a FDA establishment identifier, which is what FEI means, based on a firm name and address, or to validate an address of an FEI. So that is one portal that you can use to kind of help you in that process. Contact information, estimated arrival date and time. The entry will not be transmitted to the FDA for review until 5 days before the arrival date. So this is something to keep in mind. You can, a lot of customs brokers and importers will pre-file or will file this paperwork obviously much earlier than their goods are going to arrive, because obviously there's a lot of time in transit. The FDA won't actually start looking over these things and reviewing them until 5 days before the arrival date. FDA affirmation of compliance. In some instances, this is mandatory. And then quantity and value. And as far as I can tell, this is a voluntary submission. This information is the basic info that will be required for every FDA entry. However, there will be additional data requirements for certain products. So make sure that you look through the supplemental guide on those specific items on the FDA website. Again, we really can't get into the specifics for every single commodity type within one presentation. That's going to have to be something that's done kind of on a commodity specific presentation that maybe we can, put some stuff together in the future for those maybe bigger ticket commodities. But at the moment, these are, the basic information, data points that you're going to have to include. Now, like I mentioned before, the same general basic information will be required for manual submissions. However, the entry documentation must be provided directly to the importer or the importer's local FDA import office for review. Now, although the decision-making process for the FDA entry reviewers remains the same, so it's going to be the same criteria they're looking at, The automated pre-screening process will not be possible on manual entries. Therefore, all entries submitted manually will have to be reviewed by the FDA manually and will take longer to process. We did have a question concerning the fact that freight forwarders have mandated that importers file digitally as of around 2018. And this individual was wondering if the digital data factor would lead to increased scrutiny of FDA entries. This is a bit of a multi-layered answer. While I can't fully speak on why more FDA entries have been red flagged without knowing a little bit more about the commodity being brought in, I can say that overall, the import process as a whole has been moving forward technology-wise for years now. And you can kind of track that with the evolving implementation of ACE. This movement has absolutely made it easier for government agencies such as Customs and the FDA to mine data and isolate potential risk. This is why it's becoming more and more important to become an informed importer when it comes to compliance. However, this does come with an advantage for importers as well. For example, in the case of FDA, entries that are filed digitally are able to move through the first part of the review process faster and potentially be cleared quicker. This is also why freight forwarders would mandate electronic filing. It is overall easier since there is no trip to the local FDA office, and shipments can be processed faster. So let's take a look at that review process. It may be an obvious place to start, but first of all entries into the US must be declared through Customs and Border Protection. Once it is cleared by CBP and they see it is flagged for FDA, they will then refer the entry to the FDA for review. All shipments of FDA regulated products are examined by the FDA. When under review, the FDA is ensuring that all FDA regulated products imported into the US comply with the same FDA laws and regulations that apply to domestic products. This is an important distinction. The FDA is ensuring that all products under its jurisdiction are held to the same standard once they have entered the US. Once the entry has been referred to the FDA, it is electronically screened. The screening tool uses various sources of information to assess risk. For example, a firm's previous compliance history or known compliance problems with a certain product. Products considered higher risk, which would most likely be those FD3 and FD4 products, so mostly food products, and entry submissions with incomplete or inaccurate information are flagged for manual review by the FDA to determine the admissibility of the product. It is very common for the FDA to flag an entry and then outright refuse it for inaccurate information, missing information, or mislabeled packaging. Regardless of if this was an honest mistake, the FDA can and will refuse an entry based on errors in paperwork. Also keep in mind that if you file manually, your entry will not go through the electronic screening. The entry will automatically be flagged for a manual review by the FDA. Now, these are the three potential outcomes of the FDA review process. Release of the product. Entry reviewers may issue a release of the product. This means the product can be distributed into US commerce. However, and this is very important, a release does not preclude future FDA action if a problem is found later. A good example of things that would of things like this would be a food recall. A food item may have been released by the FDA only to be found to contain E. coli after it has been ingested by the public. Now, this is an example that we have all seen in the past. The FDA is then able to issue a recall and demand the redelivery of the entry. Of course, it is impossible to fully comply with this demand since some of the entry has already been consumed by the public. But we will get into, a little bit more about this in future slides, what redelivery means. Another outcome is requests for additional information. Sometimes the information contained in the electronic entry is not sufficient to make an admissible decision. Review of the shipping and entry documents may help in this determination, and sometimes examining the product or collecting a sample for laboratory analysis may be needed. We will not be going over FDA sampling and examinations in this webinar, since that is better suited for a more in-depth look into the process. But be aware that if the FDA determines that an examination is required or that they need to take a sample and have it tested, it is the importer that will be paying for the cost of that examination. This will include the cost of the testing, even down to the cost of the wages for the FDA employees' time. And finally, request detention of the product. Based upon the review, the entry information, the appearance of a violation may be present. This may be due to the product and/or the manufacturer being subject to detention without physical examination. This is also referred to as DWPE. Or could be because compliance with a particular requirement cannot be verified. For example, if the declared manufacturer of a drug product cannot be found in the FDA's drug registration database, if they just can't find the information, it might be refused. In these situations, FDA's entry reviewers may request detention of your product based on the appearance of a violation. Entry reviewers forward the request for detention to the FDA compliance branch for further review. So in more plain English, this means that your entry has been refused by the FDA. So why was entry denied? FDA monitored goods are denied entry if they seem to be or have been discovered to be contaminated, meaning the goods are not safe, they are not authorized, they do not meet acceptable standards, they have improperly marked labels that contain inaccurate or misleading information, they are not registered and or listed, or they are forbidden and restricted from sale. So your entry is denied. Now what? Well, the importer has two options if entry is denied. Either destroy the product under FDA and CBP supervision, or export the product under FDA and CBP supervision. One of these two options must occur within 90 days of the date of the notice of FDA action, also known as the refusal notice. If the importer fails to do one of these two options within the given time frame, CBP may assess liquidated damages against the importer's customs bond. Now this leads us to the topic of why your surety is concerned about FDA. Well, before we can jump straight to that, we have to quickly clarify what a customs bond is. A U.S. customs bond is a three-party contract between a bond principal, a Treasury-listed surety, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection, also known as CBP. Having a bond on file is a mandatory requirement of the process of importing in the United States, and goods will not be cleared at their port of entry without one. If there is a claim on your customs bond, the surety becomes liable in the event that the principal on the bond, the importer, cannot or will not pay. An example of a claim resulting from importing FDA-regulated products would be an FDA redelivery claim. Something that is not always known by importers, and this is going more into FDA redelivery claims, many importers don't realize that the release of entries subject to FDA, so when they are released from CBP custody, it is actually deemed a conditional release. So that conditional release lasts until one of the earliest of the following events occurs. The date that the FDA issues a notice of refusal of admission, so they've refused the product, the date the FDA issues a notice the merchandise may proceed, so the FDA has officially released it themselves, or upon the end of the 30-day period following the date of release. Even though CBP has released the goods from their custody, the FDA can demand redelivery of an entry at any point within that 30-day conditional release period. If 100% of the entry is not redelivered or destroyed, the claim will be issued. This conditional release period, that 30-day period, may be extended by the FDA if they deem it necessary. However, the FDA must issue a written or electronic notice of sampling, detention, or other FDA action to the bond principal, that is typically the importer, within 30 days of the release of the merchandise for it to be valid. So within that 30-day period, if they're extending those 30 days, they have to send you notice of basically why they're extending it, what is happening. There actually is a online resource where you can track the status of your entry and whether FDA has done one of these three things on it. It's called ITACS, ITACS.com, I believe. I'm going to be including that link in the follow-up email to this webinar. So if that's something that you want to look at or something that you've never looked at in the past, we'll be including the link then. Now, if the entry is refused by the FDA, the importer is given 90 days to either destroy or export the goods under the FDA and CBP's supervision. Failure to redeliver the merchandise will result in a liquidated damage claim equal to 3 times the value of the merchandise or for the full amount of the bond in place. This liquidated damage claim will be issued if 100% of the refused merchandise is not delivered. Here at TRG, we have seen situations where an importer was only able to deliver, let's say, 15 out of 20 cartons of a product that the FDA demanded redelivery of. Since 100% of that entry was not redelivered, a liquidated damage was issued for 3 times the value of the merchandise. So you can see how basically there's a lot of risk when it comes to importing FDA. If your goods are refused and you're not able to do one of these two things, you're going to get a pretty substantial liquidated damage claim. And you know, that money owed to customs, obviously, if it's 3 times the value of the merchandise, is a lot more than what the merchandise itself costs. So quickly adds up. With all of this considered, you can kind of begin to see why your surety is more concerned for entries containing FDA regulated products. Since the surety is one of the 3 parties involved in the customs bond, and they will be held responsible by customs for any monies owed if the importer is unwilling or unable to pay, you can see why the monetary size of the claim itself is a very large concern to the surety. Also, it is very difficult to comply with the redelivery demand. First off, the goods must be exported or destroyed under the supervision of both the FDA and CBP within the 90-day timeframe. We have seen large claims issued purely due to the fact that the importer was unable to coordinate a time and/or place between those 2 different departments. Regardless of the effort put in by the importer, if the time frame ends and the goods have not been exported or destroyed, CBP will issue the claim. And finally, as we discussed before, it is sometimes difficult to redeliver 100% of the refused merchandise. Since many of the goods regulated by the FDA are perishable, importers will ship them to their end consumers as soon as they are released from customs custody. However, as we discussed earlier, this release is conditional until the FDA issues an approval, a refusal, or the end of the 30-day period comes. Therefore, many times the goods have already been sold or used by the time a redelivery demand is issued. All right, now we are going to go through a few of the questions that were submitted prior to the webinar. To get started, we did receive a lot of questions about how to import PPE. We actually released a presentation going over this topic back in May, and it is currently live on our YouTube channel. It is called A Guide to Importing Personal Protective Equipment, and it is about 11 minutes long. For anyone looking for an introduction to that topic, I would suggest watching that video first. We also have a few blog posts kind of going over the topic as well for more insight. We also received a handful of questions regarding the restrictions and recalls around hand sanitizers in the last couple of months. There's a lot to cover here, with basically the overview being that there have been more than 100 hand sanitizer brands that have been deemed dangerous by the FDA, and recalls have been issued. For a fully updated list of these products and the warnings that have been issued, see the FDA webpage linked on the slide. Now, again, this link will be sent out in the follow-up email after this webinar, so if you're not able to copy it down right now, you will receive it then. And this page on the FDA website is pretty constantly updated. This is the page that they're kind of putting everything on. So for more information on this and the most up-to-date information on this, this is the page you kind of want to be looking at. Another question we received about PPE is, have more PPE products fallen under any new EUA waivers? The best resource for constant updates on this topic is the link on the screen. Similar to the previous link, this is where the FDA is constantly putting this information. So this is a page directly on the FDA website on the topic of personal protective equipment, EUAs. There's also links. There are also links on the side of this page for more information on EUAs issued for other medical devices. So this is a great page to go to and kind of read through what applies to you. For anyone that does not know what this is, EUA stands for Emergency Use Authorization, and this authorizes the FDA to facilitate availability of an unapproved product or an unapproved use of an approved product during a declared state of emergency from one of several agencies of a material threat by the Secretary of Homeland Security. That's a long definition of that. Basically, this has been issued to address concerns about the availability of PPE and other medical devices during the COVID-19 pandemic. One question we received was, starting in 2020, we are hitting FDA emissions and census triggers on almost every shipment. What has changed? After doing some research specifically into any changes made in 2020 for emissions and census triggers from the FDA, the only concrete publication I could find was an import alert on the FDA's website titled Import Alert 95-04. I've included the link to this alert on the slide for further reading, but basically this report was originally published back in December of 1997, and then a major revision was made July 30th of 2010, and it was more recently updated April 20th of 2020. The alert states that certain products sourced from a list of manufacturers could be detained without physical examination. There were 2 manufacturers added to the list in February and April of 2020, both of which were located in China. This update could be the reason for an increase in FDA admissions and census triggers. I really would need to know more about, who and what you're importing from in order to kind of answer that. But the best advice I can give concerning, if this is why, would be to check your suppliers and make sure they have not been red flagged by the FDA. There's always a chance that a supplier you've used for years, there's been a new case or been something new, some new issue that has, arisen that the FDA has basically red flagged them. Another potential reason for an increase would be an increase in overall FDA scrutiny. But I have not really seen any official publications indicating this, so basically only the agency themselves would be able to really provide that kind of insight until an official announcement has been made. Another question, when do you need to register with the FDA as an importer? This highly depends on what type of commodity you are importing. Instead of listing the process for each commodity type, you should go to this link on the screen and read the specifics for the category your product falls into. I will be sending out this link as well in the follow-up email to the webinar. Typically, the follow-up email we send out the day after the webinar so that we can also include the full recording of this live session. But the top categories, the categories for what needs to be registered and when, are those 8 categories we discussed earlier. So cosmetics, drugs, food, medical devices, radiation emitting products, tobacco products, and vaccines, blood, and biologics. Once you determine which category your product falls under, you can read the requirements for that specific category. We went over each of these earlier, so if you need to kind of figure out where you fall, you can rewatch that section of the webinar on the recording. Another question we received was, what changes to a product require a new FDA approval? This may not be the answer you were hoping for, but the safest option is to seek a new approval whenever any change is made to a product. This is especially true if any material changes have been made to the product itself. And by material, I don't only mean the actual physical material, but also anything that changes any aspect of how the product functions or is assembled. The reason for this is that the FDA's mission is to protect the health and safety of the public. Any approval that has been previously issued was done so given the known facts about the product at that time. Any change to the product may change the safety of that product or how it will impact the health of the public. We actually received a couple different versions of this question with some more specific case examples. But basically the question is, do I need to file with the FDA if my product is for internal use only and will not be sold to the public? The short answer is yes. I have mentioned a couple times that the FDA's mission is to protect the health and safety of the public. And the important thing here to remember is that you are part of the public. Just because the product is not intended to be sold to consumers does not mean that it does not have to be deemed safe. I think this misunderstanding may also stem from another misunderstanding around the term entry for consumption. A consumption entry is anything being imported for commercial, business, or personal use. Therefore, any commodity being imported into the United States must undergo the same entry process with Customs and Border Protection and with the FDA if that product falls under their regulation. Therefore, whether or not the item will be sold has no bearing on whether or not the product has to comply with CBP or the FDA. When the FDA states that the intended use matters, this refers to whether the commodity will be interacting with a living body in the ways discussed earlier in the presentation. Okay, so this is a topic we weren't really going to get into in this basic overview, but we received a question, so I thought I would provide at least a quick answer. The question is, what is FSVP? Is this required for all products? And if a client is bringing in only a few shipments of food a year, does he need an FSVP? Well, FSVP stands for Foreign Supplier Verification Programs. And this was mandated by the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act. The shortest explanation is that the FSVP requires importers to verify that their foreign suppliers of food for human and animal consumption meet applicable FDA safety standards. Also, FSVP compliance is not based on the size of the importer. This means that regardless of if the importer is bringing in 2 or 2,000 shipments of food within a year, they need to comply with FSVP requirements. The link included on this slide is a great resource explaining FSVP and answering some of the initial questions importers have about it. And this is, again, directly from the FDA. Okay, so now we're going to open up the discussion for questions to Rachel. As a disclaimer, Rachel is TRG's bond claims manager, so she is an expert in the claims process, and has years of experience helping importers navigate the confusion of claims that arise on their bond. Therefore, the questions she will be able to answer the most thoroughly will be around the topic of claims. Also, this is a topic we feel does not really get that much attention and honestly can end up costing importers a lot of money. So I think, let's try to keep your questions centered around that. Any questions on the specific situation of your import process will have to be answered outside the webinar. Now, we always encourage you to ask those questions, and we love to provide guidance for you and help you find the information you're looking for. But for the sake of time, Rachel will focus on those questions around FDA claims. To give you, some time to submit those questions, I know, it takes a second to type all that out. I'd like to take a moment to talk about TRG briefly. I wanted to, basically just take this second while you guys submit your questions. We are an international trade agency. We work directly with importers and exporters, and we've been doing so for about 27 years now. We've got over 13,000 clients that we work with every day, specifically discussing these complex topics and helping them navigate through this world of customs. We're an additional resource for importers with their customs broker and freight forwarder. So our model does not only help save time and money, our multi-year billing cycles are significantly less, usually on a custom bond than what the average would be. Typically, people are paying somewhere between $475 and $525 for their customs bond, and we are down to $225 a year with our multi-year pricing on a $50,000 bond. We even have pricing as low as $200 for those that qualify. You can continue to work with any broker or forwarder of your choice, and then our in-house claims assistants from licensed customs brokers are going to help you navigate any issues that come up along the way. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic over to Rachel to answer some of your questions.
Thanks, Meredith, for the informative presentation. So one question I see here in the chat is the penalty amount, 3 times the value of the full shipment or 3 times the value only on the unreturned merchandise. So while initially it is likely that the penalty will be issued for the full value of the shipment, it is possible to mitigate that amount down to only the unreturned merchandise. Ultimately, if you're not able to redeliver all of the merchandise in compliance with an FDA notice, you will be penalized for it. And it's likely to be 3 times the amount of what was not able to be returned. One of the most common questions that I get when I notify an importer of a redelivery claim is, what do I do now? My first response is always talk to your broker about the entry itself, and then do keep in mind that you have to coordinate with both the FDA and customs for the resolution of the claim. As soon as that liquidated damages case is initiated, it's on a 60-day time frame for resolution. And most often the delays in resolving claims that I see is trying to coordinate with the FDA to either export or destroy the product and also get all of the information submitted to customs in a timely manner. It's really important to work as hard as you can to comply with all of the timelines involved. And I also see a question about finding product codes. If it was a rejected FDA entry, I would always recommend talking directly with your customs broker to determine the right product code, HTS code for your specific commodity. Again, if you have specific questions about your supply chain and importing practices, the best point of contact is going to be your customs broker, as they are ultimately the expert in these types of questions. Let's see. I'm just gonna scroll through a couple of these and see if there's ones that I can easily answer. Some of these look like they're going to require a more in-depth answer. And so after your product was detained and deemed destroyed, can the importer request a refund on their duty paid? I'll have to look into that. That's actually a really good question. Yeah, so the rest of these questions, it looks like we'll have to dig into a little bit more in order to answer them, but always feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you might have. And I'm going to turn it back over to Meredith to wrap up our webinar.
Thank you, Rachel. And I know it kind of sounds, it might be frustrating to get that answer of talk to your broker, but we always like to remind you that the broker isn't just somebody you hire to do something that and you don't want to bother them. They are a member of your team. So if you are a small business, a medium business, a business that doesn't have a compliance team of their own, you're hiring a broker to join your import team, meaning that open dialogue is a very important part of the process. They are really going to be the best resource when it comes to these highly specific questions on your import process. We're going to try to provide answers where we can, but ultimately, really digging into your specific case is something to do with your broker. But thank you so much for attending today's webinar. We know that right now is a very confusing and unprecedented time, and the TRG team really wants to be there to provide support where we can. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly by email at marketing@traderiskguarantee.com. Additionally, check out our blog. It's found at traderiskguarantee.com/trgpeak. It's got a treasure trove of excellent articles and information. Also, don't forget to find us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and of course, YouTube. We will be sending a follow-up email tomorrow with links from the presentation, so look out for that in your inbox. And again, thank you for attending today's webinar.